The snow fell silent on Christmas Eve, but Noah heard every flake land, each one a reminder of the empty space beside him. He sat on the porch, watching Casey's sleeping silhouette through the frosted window, his breath forming clouds that disappeared too quickly, like everything else he'd tried to hold on to. Then she appeared. Scarlett, his neighbor for 6 weeks, the woman who never turned on all her lights, who jumped at car doors slamming, who smiled at his son, but never at herself. She held 2 mugs, steam rising between them like a question. "This Christmas, what's your wish?" Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. Noah looked at those shaking hands, manicured nails on a woman who lived like she was hiding, designer coat worn like armor over someone who'd forgotten how to be warm. He swallowed the truth he'd never said aloud. "I wish I wasn't alone." Scarlett didn't flinch, didn't offer empty comfort. She just sat down beside him, and in that moment, Noah realized something. Her silence felt like someone who understood loneliness, not as an absence, but as a presence. Something you carried, something that followed you even when you ran. What was she running from? And why did her sitting there feel less like comfort and more like a warning? 6 weeks earlier, Noah Brennan had been measuring a cabinet frame in his workshop when he heard the moving truck next door. Through the window, he watched a woman step out of a black sedan, overdressed for their small Connecticut town, her cashmere scarf wrapped high enough to hide half her face. She moved quickly, scanning the street before hurrying inside. The driver unloaded only 3 boxes. 3. Most people arrived with furniture, photo albums, the accumulated weight of a life lived. This woman arrived like someone who'd left everything behind on purpose. Noah wiped sawdust from his hands and walked over, carpenter's instinct pulling him toward something that needed fixing. She was struggling with a box marked fragile when he cleared his throat. She spun around, eyes wide, body tensed like she was ready to run. "Sorry," he said, raising his palms. "I'm Noah, next door. Thought you could use a hand." She studied him for 3 long seconds, and he could see her deciding whether to trust or flee. Finally, she nodded. "Scarlett." No last name. No explanation. Just a single word dropped between them like a test. They carried boxes in silence. Noah noticed things. The way she positioned herself with her back, never to a window. The way she flinched when a car backfired 2 streets over. The way her hands, despite the expensive manicure, had small scars along the knuckles, the kind you got from hitting something hard or being hit. When they finished, she thanked him with a politeness that felt rehearsed, like a line from a script she'd memorized long ago. As he turned to leave, his 7-year-old son Casey appeared on their porch, holding a wooden airplane Noah had carved. "Dad, can I show her?" Casey called out. Before Noah could answer, Scarlett's entire demeanor shifted. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. Her smile, for the first time, reached her eyes. "Is that yours?" she asked Casey, crouching to his level. Casey nodded, launching into an explanation about how his dad made it from maple wood, how it could almost fly if you threw it right. Scarlett listened like Casey was telling her the secrets of the universe, not rambling about a toy plane. When Casey finished, she said quietly, "Your dad must be very patient." Something in her voice made Noah think she was talking about more than woodworking. That became their pattern over the next 6 weeks. Casey would spot Scarlett in her yard and race over with something to show. A drawing, a rock he'd found, a story about school. Scarlett would listen with an attention so complete it made Noah's chest ache. His son had been only 4 when his wife, Angela, died from an aneurysm that gave no warning, no chance for goodbye. For 3 years, Casey had been learning to live with absence. Now here was Scarlett, offering presents without asking for anything in return. Noah started finding excuses to be outside when she was. He fixed her porch railing without being asked. She baked banana bread that appeared on his doorstep, with a note that said simply, "Thank you." No signature needed. The evening before Thanksgiving, Noah was raking leaves when Scarlett emerged, wearing an oversized Yale sweatshirt and jeans that looked new, like she was trying on someone else's life. "That's a lot of leaves," she said, almost shyly. He shrugged. "Comes with the trees." She picked up the spare rake leaning against the fence. For 20 minutes, they worked side by side, the scrape of metal on concrete the only sound between them. When they finished, she looked at the pile they'd made and said, "I haven't done something this normal in a very long time." Before he could ask what she meant, Casey burst through the door, yelling about a show he wanted to watch, and the moment dissolved. Thanksgiving came and went. Noah cooked turkey for two, Casey's empty chair across from him feeling less empty than it used to, because he kept thinking about Scarlett next door, probably eating alone. He'd invited her to join them, but she'd declined with that same rehearsed politeness. "I don't want to intrude," she'd said, though her eyes suggested she wanted exactly the opposite. The Friday after Thanksgiving, Casey asked the question Noah had been avoiding. "Why doesn't Scarlett have any family?" They were building a birdhouse together, Casey holding the pieces while Noah nailed them. Noah chose his words carefully. "Sometimes people need to start over. Be somewhere new." Casey considered this, his small face serious. "Like when you deleted my game because it was broken, and we had to start from level 1? Noah smiled despite himself. "Something like that, buddy." Casey hammered a nail with intense concentration, then looked up. "I like her, Dad. She listens different than other grown-ups." Noah knew exactly what his son meant. Most adults listened to Casey with half their attention, waiting for him to finish so they could respond. Scarlett listened like she was memorizing every word, storing them somewhere safe. It was the listening of someone who knew what it meant to not be heard. December arrived with the first real snow. Noah started his truck one morning to find a scraper on his windshield. Scarlett's, left there sometime before dawn. He returned it that evening with a thermos of coffee. She opened the door in reading glasses and a sweater, with a small moth hole near the hem, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. "You didn't have to," she said, but she took the thermos. "You didn't have to scrape my windshield," he replied. She smiled, and for a moment neither of them moved, standing in the doorway with cold air rushing between them. Finally, she stepped back. "Would you like to come in?" Her house was barely furnished. A couch, a lamp, books stacked in corners because she had no shelves, no photographs on the walls, no personal touches that said who she was or where she'd been. Noah noticed what was missing more than what was there. "I'm working on it," she said, following his gaze. "It's perfect," he lied, and they both knew it. She poured his coffee into 2 mugs, expensive ceramic that didn't match anything else in the sparse kitchen. They sat at her breakfast bar, knees almost touching, and talked about nothing important. The weather, the town, Casey's obsession with space. But beneath the mundane words, something else was being said. She told him she worked remotely doing consulting, but never said for whom. He told her about losing Angela, but not about the nights he still reached for her side of the bed. When Casey's bedtime came and went, Noah stood to leave. Scarlett walked him to the door, and in the threshold, she touched his arm. Just briefly. Just enough. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked. She looked at him like she was about to say something true, something that cost her, but then shook her head. "For the coffee." As he walked home, Noah realized he was tired of coffee being a metaphor. He wanted to know what she was thanking him for. He wanted to know why a woman who could afford designer coats lived in a rental house with 3 boxes of belongings. He wanted to know why she flinched at car doors and never turned on all her lights. The second week of December brought Casey's winter concert. Noah sat in the elementary school auditorium, surrounded by complete families. feeling the familiar ache of being half of something that used to be whole. The kids filed onto the stage. Casey spotted him and waved. Noah waved back, and then he saw her. Scarlett, standing in the very back corner, half hidden behind a pillar. She hadn't mentioned she was coming. She was watching Casey with an expression Noah couldn't quite read, something between joy and grief. Like she was remembering someone else. After the concert, he found her outside in the parking lot, breath fogging in the cold. "You came," he said. She turned, startled, then softened. "I hope that's okay. Casey mentioned it last week, and I just thought." She stopped herself. Noah stepped closer. "It's more than okay." They stood there in the dark, snow beginning to fall again, and he wanted to ask her everything. Who she was running from. Why she looked at Casey like he reminded her of someone she'd lost. Why she was here, in his town, in his life, at his son's concert. But he didn't, because he was afraid if he pushed, she'd disappear. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. He nodded. "Does it get easier? The alone part?" Her voice was small, uncertain, not like her usual careful control. Noah thought about the question. About the 3 years since Angela, about the mornings that still felt wrong and the evenings that stretched too long. "No," he said honestly, "but you get better at carrying it." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw it. The recognition. She understood. She was carrying something too, something heavy enough to make her run, to make her hide, to make her live like a ghost in her own life. "Come to dinner," he said impulsively. "Tomorrow night. Me and Casey. Nothing fancy, just..." He struggled for the word. "Just not alone." Scarlett's eyes glistened, but she blinked it back. "I'd like that," she whispered. As she walked to her car, Noah realized he'd just done something terrifying. He'd started hoping again. Hope was dangerous. Hope required believing that good things could last. And his experience had taught him they couldn't. But watching Scarlett's tail lights disappear into the snow, he couldn't make himself regret it. The next evening, Scarlett arrived at 6 o'clock with a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Noah's weekly grocery budget. She'd changed clothes 3 times, he could tell. There was a nervousness to her that felt like his own. Casey immediately pulled her into the living room to show her his Lego space station, and Noah watched from the kitchen doorway as she sat cross-legged on the floor, asking Casey questions about airlock mechanisms like she genuinely wanted to know. This was what he'd been missing, he realized. Not just a woman, but someone who could see his son, really see him, and treat him like he mattered. Dinner was spaghetti and meatballs, Casey's favorite. Nothing impressive. But Scarlett ate like it was a feast, complimenting the sauce, laughing at Casey's jokes, letting the boy talk without interruption. After dinner, Casey challenged her to a puzzle race. They sat at the coffee table, 2 puzzles side by side, racing to finish. Noah did dishes and watched them through the kitchen doorway. This strange domestic scene that felt both foreign and exactly right. Scarlett's competitive streak emerged. She was fast, methodical, and when Casey beat her by 6 seconds, she threw her hands up in genuine defeat. "You're too good," she laughed, and Casey beamed like he'd won the lottery. At 8:30, Casey hugged Scarlett goodnight without being prompted, then trudged upstairs. Noah heard the water running for teeth brushing, heard his son's footsteps overhead, and felt the evening shift. Suddenly, it was just the 2 of them, sitting on his worn couch with the gas fireplace casting shadows on the walls. "He's wonderful," Scarlett said softly. "You've done an amazing job." Noah shook his head. "I'm just trying not to screw him up." She smiled sadly. That's what good parents do. They worry about screwing up. The bad ones think they're doing everything right. Something in her tone made him ask, "Did your parents worry?" Her smile vanished. No. One word, flat and final. She stood abruptly, moving toward the bookshelf, studying the spines like she was reading a map to somewhere else. Noah joined her. "Scarlett," he said quietly, "you don't have to tell me anything. But if you want to." She turned to face him, and he saw her fighting with herself, deciding how much truth to risk. "I had a son," she said finally. The words dropped between them like stones into still water. His name was Dylan. He died 2 years ago. He was 9. Noah's breath caught. Suddenly everything made sense. The way she looked at Casey, the way she listened like she was memorizing moments, the way she'd said it doesn't get easier. You just get better at carrying it. "Scarlett, I'm so sorry." She wrapped her arms around herself, that invisible armor sliding back into place. "It was a car accident. My fault, according to my ex-husband. Maybe he was right." Her voice cracked on the last word. Noah wanted to reach for her, to tell her no parent was to blame for an accident, but she held up a hand. "Please don't. If you're kind right now, I'll fall apart. And I can't. I can't fall apart anymore." So he didn't move. He just stood there, giving her space while staying close enough that she'd know she wasn't alone. After a minute, she continued. "My marriage ended that day, too. Preston, my ex-husband, he blamed me, controlled me, made sure I knew every day that I'd failed our son. I stayed for a year after Dylan died, becoming smaller and smaller until I didn't recognize myself anymore. Then one night, I just left. I had a friend who helped me disappear. I've been hiding ever since." She laughed bitterly. "Not very successfully, apparently. Preston's been looking for me. I think he might have found me." Noah's mind raced. "The man who came by last week, asking questions?" She nodded. "Private investigator. Preston doesn't want me back because he loves me. He wants me back because I'm his. He doesn't let go of what belongs to him." The fear in her voice was real, visceral. And Noah felt something fierce wake up inside him. "You don't belong to anyone," he said firmly. "You belong to yourself." She met his eyes, and in that look, he saw hope and terror fighting for dominance. "I shouldn't have come here. I shouldn't have let Casey get attached. I shouldn't have—" She stopped, but Noah heard the rest. "I shouldn't have let myself feel anything." "But you did," he said gently. "And I'm glad you did." She looked at him like he'd said something in a foreign language. "Why?" she whispered. "Because," he said, taking a careful step closer. "For the first time in 3 years, my son has laughed at dinner every night this week. For the first time since Angela died, I've wanted to come home. You think you're broken, Scarlett, but you're not. You're just hurt. There's a difference." She shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "You don't know what you're saying. Preston will destroy anything I touch. If he finds me here, if he knows about you and Casey." Noah did something then that surprised them both. He reached out and took her hand, the one with the scarred knuckles, the one that had been trembling that first day they met. "Let him try," he said quietly. Scarlett stared at their joined hands like she couldn't believe they were real. Then she pulled away, grabbing her coat. "I have to go." She was out the door before Noah could stop her, leaving behind her wine glass and the puzzle she hadn't finished. He stood in his living room, heart pounding, realizing he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He'd just told a woman he barely knew that he'd stand between her and whatever was chasing her. He'd just promised to fight for someone again. And the scariest part was, he meant it. The days before Christmas blurred together. Scarlett avoided him, ducking inside whenever she saw him, not answering her door when Casey knocked. Noah gave her space, but Casey didn't understand. "Did I do something wrong?" his son asked one evening, staring at Scarlett's dark house. "No, buddy," Noah assured him. "Sometimes Adults need time to figure things out. But he was lying. He knew exactly what was happening. Scarlett was pulling away because she cared too much, because caring meant risking, and risk meant potential loss. He understood that impulse. He'd lived it for 3 years. Christmas Eve arrived with heavy snow and temperatures dropping below 20 degrees. Noah and Casey spent the day baking cookies, hanging stockings, watching holiday movies. But Noah kept looking out the window at Scarlett's house, at the single light burning in her kitchen, and thinking about her sitting there alone. At 7 o'clock, Casey went to bed, too excited about Santa to actually sleep. Noah made himself hot chocolate, put on his coat, and went out to the porch. He didn't plan to sit there. He didn't plan to wait for her. But somehow, that's what happened. And then she came. Walking through the snow in that designer coat, carrying 2 mugs, her hand shaking not from cold, but from whatever decision she'd just made. When she asked him his wish, when he told her the truth, when she sat down beside him, that was when Noah realized he'd been wrong about hope. Hope wasn't dangerous because it might break your heart. Hope was dangerous because it made you want to protect someone else's heart more than your own. He wanted to protect Scarlett. He wanted to fight for her. He wanted to prove that not all men controlled and blamed and destroyed. They sat in silence for a long time, shoulders almost touching, breath mingling in the frozen air. Finally, Scarlett spoke. "I bought a bus ticket to Seattle. I was going to leave tomorrow morning without saying goodbye. I thought it would be easier that way." Noah's chest tightened, but he didn't respond. She needed to finish. "But then I thought about Casey asking why I left. I thought about you thinking I didn't care. And I realized," her voice broke, "I realized I'm so tired of running. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of letting Preston take everything from me. He took my son, my life, my name. I'm not giving him this too." Noah turned to look at her. "This?" he asked. She met his eyes, and in the porch light, he could see she'd been crying. "You," she whispered. "Casey. This little ordinary life that feels more real than anything I've had in 15 years. Noah felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd kept carefully sealed since the day Angela died. "Scarlett," he said carefully, "I need you to understand something. If you stay, if we do this, I'm all in. I don't know how to be casual. I'm a single dad with a 7-year-old who's already half in love with you. I work with my hands. I live in a small house in a small town, and I can't compete with private investigators or billionaire ex-husbands. But if you're willing to stay, if you're willing to fight, then I'm right there with you." She was crying openly now, not trying to hide it. "Why?" she asked again. "Why would you do that?" Noah thought about the answer, about Angela telling him on their 3rd date that she knew he was the kind of man who would hold the world up if you asked him to. He thought about Casey drawing pictures of families with a mom and dad and child, because even though he'd lost his mother, he still believed in happy endings. He thought about Scarlett listening to his son like he was the most important person in the world, about her scarred knuckles and trembling hands and the courage it took to run in the first place. "Because," Noah said finally, "you already did the hard part. You already saved yourself. You walked away from someone who hurt you. You started over with nothing. You taught yourself how to be scared and brave at the same time. All I'm offering is to stand next to you while you figure out what comes next. That's not heroic. That's just," he searched for the word, "that's just showing up." Scarlett let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Just showing up," she repeated. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Noah said. "Not easy, but simple." He stood, offering his hand. "Come inside. It's freezing out here." Scarlett looked at his hand for a long moment, and he could see her calculating risk and reward, fear, and hope. Then she took it. Her fingers were ice cold, but she held on tight as they walked inside. Noah led her to the couch, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and made her drink the hot chocolate that had gone lukewarm. She cradled the mug like it was precious. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "What's this?" he asked. Normal. Trusting someone. Believing I deserve to be happy. Noah sat beside her, close enough that their knees touched. Nobody knows how to do it at first. You just keep showing up, day after day. And one day, you realize you're not pretending anymore. Scarlett looked at him with those haunted eyes. What if Preston finds me? What if he comes here? Noah didn't sugarcoat it. Then we'll deal with it. Together. You're not alone in this, Scarlett. Not anymore. She searched his face like she was looking for the lie, the catch, the moment he'd reveal himself to be just another man who wanted to control her. But Noah just looked back, steady and patient, the way he'd learned to be with wood that needed time to settle into its final form. "Okay," she whispered finally. "Okay." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of forever. It was just a woman deciding to stop running long enough to see what might happen if she stayed. They sat there until the fire burned low, not talking, just breathing together. When Scarlett finally stood to leave, she paused at the door. "Merry Christmas, Noah," he smiled. "Merry Christmas, Scarlett." As she walked across the snow to her house, Noah watched through the window. For the first time since she'd arrived, she turned on every light in her house, every single one. Christmas morning arrived with Casey thundering down the stairs at 6 a.m., launching himself onto Noah's bed with the enthusiasm of someone who'd waited exactly as long as he could. They opened presents, ate cinnamon rolls, built Legos, and through it all, Noah kept glancing at the window, wondering if Scarlett had changed her mind overnight. At noon, there was a knock on the door. Casey raced to open it, and there she stood. No designer coat this time, just jeans and a simple sweater holding a wrapped package. "I thought," she said nervously, "if the offer's still open, I'd like to join you for Christmas dinner." Casey whooped and grabbed her hand, pulling her inside. Noah met her eyes over his son's head, and she smiled. A real smile. The kind that reached her eyes and softened the hard edges she'd carried for so long. They spent the day together, the three of them, cooking turkey, playing board games, watching Casey demonstrate every toy he'd received. It felt like a family. Not the family Noah had lost, but a different kind. A family built not on biology or history, but on choice, on showing up, on deciding that the risk of loving again was worth the possibility of losing again. That evening, after Casey had fallen asleep surrounded by wrapping paper, Noah and Scarlett sat together on the couch, exhausted and content. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for today, for last night, for not letting me run." Noah shook his head. "You didn't run. That was you, Scarlett. You chose to stay." She leaned her head on his shoulder, tentative, testing. He didn't move, just let her settle there. Let her feel safe. "What happens next?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we'll figure it out. Together." The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a blur of normalcy that felt revolutionary. Scarlett and Noah fell into a rhythm. Morning coffee on his porch, afternoon walks with Casey, evening dinners at one house or the other. She told him more about her marriage, about the slow erosion of self that happened when someone convinced you that you were never enough. He told her about the anger he'd carried after Angela died, the rage at being left behind, the guilt for being angry at someone who hadn't chosen to leave. They swapped wounds like trading cards, finding comfort in shared understanding. Casey, oblivious to the heavy conversations happening after his bedtime, simply accepted Scarlett's presence like he'd been waiting for it. He started calling her Scar, like they were old friends. She helped him with his homework, taught him to draw perspective, listened to him read aloud from his chapter books. One evening, Noah found them in the living room, Scarlett braiding Casey's hair into ridiculous patterns, while Casey giggled. The domestic intimacy of it hit him hard. This was what he'd been missing. Not just a partner, but someone who loved his son. New Year's Eve arrived cold and clear. Noah had planned a quiet evening at home, but Scarlett suggested something different. "Let's go to the town square," she said. "They have that countdown thing, right? With the fireworks?" Noah was surprised. Going into town meant being seen together, meant making their relationship public, meant Scarlett stepping out of hiding. "Are you sure?" he asked. She took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm sure. If I'm going to stay, I can't live like a ghost. I need to be real. Here. With you." So they bundled Casey up and walked downtown, joining the crowd of neighbors and strangers gathered around the makeshift stage. People Noah knew from the hardware store, from Casey's school, from Sunday morning coffee runs. They noticed Scarlett, noticed Noah's hand in hers, noticed the way Casey held her other hand, like she belonged there. The gossip would start tomorrow, he knew. Questions would be asked. But tonight, standing in the cold with this woman and his son, Noah didn't care. When the countdown started, Casey bounced with excitement. 10, 9, 8. Scarlett squeezed Noah's hand. 7, 6, 5. He looked at her, this woman who'd run from everything and chosen to stay for him. 4, 3, 2. She looked back, and he saw it. Hope. 1. Happy New Year. The fireworks exploded overhead, and in the chaos of color and sound, Noah leaned down and kissed her. It was their first kiss. Tender and tentative. A question and an answer all at once. When they pulled apart, Scarlett was crying. "Happy tears," she said quickly, laughing at herself. I'd forgotten what those felt like. Casey was still staring at the fireworks, mesmerized, unaware of the moment his father had just stolen. They walked home through streets covered in fresh snow, and for the first time in 3 years, Noah felt something he'd thought was gone forever. He felt whole. But wholeness, Noah would learn, was a fragile thing. 3 days into January, the black SUV appeared. Noah was in his workshop when he heard Casey shout. He dropped his tools and ran outside to find a man in an expensive suit, standing in Scarlett's driveway, 2 others behind him. Preston Whitmore. Even without an introduction, Noah knew. The man had Scarlett's bone structure but none of her warmth, all sharp edges and cold calculation. Scarlett stood on her porch, arms wrapped around herself, looking small. "You need to leave," Noah said, positioning himself between them. Preston smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "And you are." His voice was smooth, educated, the kind of voice used to being obeyed. "I'm Noah. This is my property you're standing on." Preston's smile widened. "Ah, the carpenter." Scarlett always did have a type. Blue-collar men who think they can save her. He shifted his attention to Scarlett. "Darling, this has gone on long enough. You've had your little adventure. It's time to come home." The word home dripped with ownership. Noah felt his hands curl into fists. Scarlett found her voice, though it shook. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Preston." He laughed, actually laughed, like she'd told a joke. "You don't have a choice. You signed a post-nuptial agreement. Remember? The one that says you forfeit everything if you abandon the marriage. Your trust fund, your family inheritance. It all reverts to me. You're living in a rental house in the middle of nowhere with no income. How long do you think you can last?" He gestured dismissively at Noah. "You think he can support you, a small-town woodworker?" Before Noah could respond, Casey appeared on the porch. "Dad?" His voice was uncertain, scared. Noah's protective instinct kicked into overdrive. "Casey, go inside." But Preston had already turned his attention to the boy. "And who's this?" "Your new family, Scarlett. Playing house with someone else's child because you couldn't keep ours alive?" The words were designed to wound, and they hit their mark. Scarlett went white. Noah started toward Preston, but she grabbed his arm. "Don't." "That's what he wants. He wants you to lose control so he can call the police, claim assault, paint me as unstable for associating with violent men." Preston pulled out his phone, showing the screen to Scarlett. "I've had my lawyers draw up papers. Sign them, come home quietly, and I'll make sure your little friends here aren't bothered. Refuse, and I'll make their lives very difficult. I have resources you can't imagine. I can make problems appear. Code violations, tax audits, CPS investigations." He glanced at Casey with manufactured concern. Is this really a stable environment for a child? A widow raising his son alone, now taking up with a woman who abandoned her own family? Noah felt cold rage settling in his chest. This was what Scarlett had been running from. Not just a controlling husband, but a man who weaponized everything. Love, law, money, even grief. Preston was offering a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Stay and watch Noah and Casey suffer, or leave and spare them. It was extortion dressed up as civility. "You have 24 hours to decide," Preston said, pocketing his phone. "I'm staying at the Hartford Marriott, room 412. He handed Scarlett a business card like they were discussing a merger, not a marriage. "Don't make this uglier than it needs to be." After Preston left, Scarlett collapsed onto her porch steps, shaking. Noah sat beside her, Casey hovering uncertainly behind them. "He's bluffing," Noah said, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Scarlett shook her head. "He never bluffs. He'll do exactly what he said. He'll destroy you, destroy Casey's life, and he'll make sure I watch." She looked at Noah with devastation in her eyes. "I have to go. I have to go back. There's no other way." "No." Casey's voice was small but fierce. They both turned to look at him. "I'm 7, but I'm not stupid. That man is bad. Mom used to tell me about bad people who pretend to be good. She said you know them because they make you feel small. He makes you feel small, Scarlett. That means he's bad." Out of the mouths of babes, Noah thought. His son had just articulated what they all knew, but Scarlett had been conditioned to accept. "Casey's right," Noah said firmly. "You're not going back. We'll fight him." Scarlett laughed bitterly. "With what?" "You heard him, Noah. He has lawyers, money, connections. What do we have?" Noah thought about that question. What did they have? A carpenter's income, a rental house, a small town in Connecticut. But they also had something Preston Whitmore had never had. "We have the truth," Noah said, "and we have people who care about what's true." Scarlett looked at him like he was naive. Truth doesn't matter when the other side can afford to lie louder. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was being foolish. But Noah had learned something in the 3 years since Angela died. When everything was taken from you, you discovered what actually mattered. And what mattered was fighting for the people you loved, even when the odds were impossible. That night, Noah made calls. He called his brother, a public defender in Boston. He called Angela's best friend, who worked for a nonprofit that helped domestic abuse survivors. He called the pastor at the community church, who knew everyone in town and had connections to local media. He called his contractor, Buddy, who'd once worked on a project for a civil rights attorney. He pulled every thread he had, and it wasn't much, but it was something. While he made calls, Scarlett sat at his kitchen table, writing. She was documenting everything: dates, incidents, the recording she'd made of Preston verbally abusing her after Dylan's funeral, the hospital records from when she'd fallen downstairs 3 times in 1 year. Casey sat beside her, coloring quietly, his presence a reminder of what they were fighting for. Not just Scarlett's freedom, but the principle that no child should learn that bullies win, that men like Preston got to keep hurting people. When Noah hung up from his last call, he had a plan. It wasn't a great plan, but it was something. His brother's colleague knew a family law attorney who'd recently won a case against a tech CEO in a custody battle. She owed him a favor. "She'll look at your documentation," Noah told Scarlett. "Pro bono, at least for the initial consultation." Scarlett looked up from her writing, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. "Why would she do that?" Noah shrugged. "Because she believes in fighting bullies, and because I called in every favor I had." The next morning they drove to Boston. The attorney, Rebecca Chen, was younger than Noah expected, sharp-eyed and direct. She listened to Scarlett's story without interruption, reviewed the documentation, and listened to the recording. When it was over, she leaned back in her chair. "This is ugly," she said bluntly. "He's right that he has resources. But he's wrong that he's untouchable." She explained that Preston's post-nuptial agreement might not hold up in court, especially if they could prove coercion. The recording was good, but they needed more. They needed witnesses, patterns of behavior, proof that Preston had systematically isolated and controlled Scarlett. "Do you have friends from before?" Rebecca asked. "People who knew you before you married him?" Scarlett shook her head. "He made sure I lost touch with everyone. My college roommate tried to stay in contact, but after Preston..." She stopped. "After he what?" Rebecca pressed gently. Scarlett swallowed hard. "After he showed up at her workplace and suggested her employer might want to know about some youthful indiscretions. She stopped taking my calls. He did that to everyone who tried to stay close. He called it protecting our privacy." Rebecca made notes. "That's good. That's a pattern we can use. What about from your marriage? Household staff? Friends of his you spent time with?" Scarlett considered. "His business partner's wife, Melissa. She was kind to me. She noticed things, but she'd never testify against Preston. Her husband's company depends on him." Rebecca smiled grimly. "Let me worry about that. You'd be surprised who's willing to tell the truth when they realize they're not alone." Over the next 2 hours, they built a strategy. It wasn't guaranteed to work. Family law was messy, and men like Preston knew how to manipulate the system. But Rebecca believed they had a shot, especially if they could prove Preston's threat to harm Noah, and Casey was part of his pattern of using intimidation to control Scarlett. They drove back to Connecticut in silence, each lost in thought. Casey had stayed with Noah's brother, spared the details of legal strategy and abuse documentation. As they pulled into Noah's driveway, Scarlett finally spoke. "Thank you." Noah turned off the engine. "You don't have to thank me." She shook her head. "Yes, I do. Most people would have let me go, would have decided I wasn't worth the trouble. But you're fighting for me like I'm worth fighting for. That's..." Her voice cracked. "That's everything." Noah reached across the console and took her hand. "Scarlett, you need to hear this. You've always been worth fighting for. Preston convinced you otherwise, but he was lying. You're smart, strong, brave, and kind. You're an amazing mother who lost her child to tragedy, not negligence. You're a woman who walked away from everything comfortable because staying meant losing yourself. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen anyone do." Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't look away. "I don't know how to be what you think I am." Noah squeezed her hand. "You already are. You just forgot for a while." The deadline Preston had given passed without Scarlett signing anything or returning his calls. 2 days later, a process server appeared with papers. Preston was suing for recovery of marital assets, claiming Scarlett had stolen jewelry and art from their shared home. It was a lie, but it was a lie he could afford to pursue. Rebecca filed a counterclaim, divorce on grounds of emotional abuse, with a request for a restraining order. The legal battle had begun. The town rallied in ways Noah hadn't expected. His pastor started a fundraiser for Scarlett's legal fees. The owner of the coffee shop where Scarlett had started spending mornings offered to testify about seeing Preston's investigator harassing her. Casey's teacher, who'd noticed how much happier the boy had been since Scarlett entered his life, wrote a character reference. It turned out that small towns, for all their gossip and judgment, also protected their own. And Scarlett, whether she realized it or not, had become one of their own. The case took weeks to build. Depositions, documentation, witness statements. Rebecca worked tirelessly, and slowly, a picture emerged. Preston Whitmore wasn't just a controlling husband. He was a man who'd systematically destroyed his wife's sense of self, who'd weaponized their son's death, who'd used his money and power to keep her trapped. The turning point came when Melissa, the business partner's wife, agreed to testify. She'd kept text messages, Scarlett reaching out years ago, saying she was scared, asking for help. Melissa had been too afraid to respond then, but she wasn't afraid anymore. With Melissa's testimony, 2 other women came forward. Preston's first wife, who'd signed a brutal NDA but was willing to break it. A former executive assistant who'd quit after witnessing his rages. Each piece of testimony painted the same picture. A man who needed total control, who couldn't tolerate anyone leaving him, who saw people as possessions. The restraining order was granted. Preston was ordered to stay away from Scarlett, from Noah, from Casey. He appealed, of course. Men like him always did. But for the first time since she'd run, Scarlett could breathe. She could sleep without jumping at every sound. She could walk through town without scanning for black SUVs. February arrived with a cold snap that froze the lake solid. Noah took Scarlett and Casey ice skating, and watching her laugh as she wobbled on rental skates, he realized something. He loved her. Not in the safe, comfortable way he'd loved Angela. The love of shared history and gradual building. This was different, fiercer. The love of choosing someone despite impossible odds. The love of seeing someone at their most broken and deciding they were still whole. That evening, after Casey went to bed, Noah and Scarlett sat by the fire. She was reading, her legs tucked under her, wearing one of his old sweatshirts because she'd gotten cold. It was ordinary, domestic, perfect. "Scarlett," he said. She looked up. "I love you." She froze, book forgotten. "Noah." He held up a hand. "You don't have to say it back. I just need you to know. I love you. I love how you listen to Casey like he's the most important person in the world. I love how you're learning to take up space again. I love your strength and your fear and your determination to be better than what happened to you. I love you." Scarlett set down her book, stood, and crossed to where he sat. She cupped his face in her hands, those scarred knuckles gentle against his skin. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I could anymore. But I do. I love you so much it terrifies me." He pulled her down onto his lap, and she came willingly, tucking her head against his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, just breathing together. Feeling safe. When she finally pulled back to look at him, her eyes were clear. What happens when this is over? When the divorce is final? When Preston is legally out of my life? Noah smiled. Then we figure out what normal looks like. We keep showing up. We keep choosing each other. She kissed him then, slow and deep, a kiss that tasted like promise. When they broke apart, she was smiling. I liked the sound of that. The divorce was finalized in April. Preston had tried every legal maneuver his expensive lawyers could devise, but in the end, the evidence was overwhelming. He'd lost. He appealed the restraining order twice, but it held. Scarlett was free, truly free, for the first time in 15 years. The post-nuptial agreement was voided due to coercion, and she received a settlement that, while smaller than what she'd brought to the marriage, was enough to build a new life. She used part of it to pay back everyone who'd contributed to her legal fund, despite their protests. She used the rest to rent studio space downtown and start teaching art to children. Noah proposed on a Saturday in June, on the same porch where she'd asked him what he wished for. He didn't have a fancy ring or an elaborate plan. He just looked at her, at this woman who'd taught him that love could happen twice, that hearts could break and break and heal again, and asked if she'd marry him. She said yes immediately, laughing and crying at the same time. Casey, who'd been watching from the window, burst through the door. "Does this mean Scarlett's really going to be my mom?" Noah looked at Scarlett, letting her answer. She knelt down to Casey's level. "If that's okay with you." Casey threw his arms around her neck. "That's really okay with me." They married in September, a small ceremony in Noah's backyard, with 50 people who'd become family. No designer dress this time. Just a simple white sundress and bare feet in the grass. Casey stood between them during the ceremony, holding both their hands, part of the promise they were making. When the pastor asked if anyone objected, there was a beat of tense silence. Everyone knew Preston had been served notice of the wedding, but he didn't come. He'd finally accepted that Scarlett was beyond his reach. The reception was potluck. The music was a playlist on someone's phone, and it was perfect. Angela's parents came, which surprised Noah. But Angela's mother hugged Scarlett and whispered something that made her cry, and Noah realized his first wife would have approved of his second. That night, after Casey was asleep and the last guests had left, Noah and Scarlett sat on their porch. It was theirs now, not just his. The night was clear, stars bright above them. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She leaned against him. "I'm thinking about Dylan, about how he would have liked you, liked Casey, about how I wish he could have known this version of me, the one who's not afraid." Noah kissed the top of her head. "He knew you loved him. That's what matters." She was quiet for a moment. "And I'm thinking about last Christmas, when you told me you wished you weren't alone. I was so lonely that night, so close to giving up. And then I heard that, and I thought maybe I wasn't the only one." Noah remembered that moment, the snow falling, the honesty that had scared him. "We saved each other," he said. She shook her head. "You gave me a reason to save myself. There's a difference." Maybe she was right. Maybe that's what love was. Not rescuing someone, but standing beside them while they did the hard work of rescuing themselves. "Scarlett," he said after a while. "Yeah?" He smiled in the darkness. "I'm glad you stayed." She laced her fingers through his. "Me too." December came around again, bringing the year full circle. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after Scarlett had asked Noah his wish, they stood on that same porch. Casey was inside, finally asleep after hours of excited whispers about Santa. Snow fell just like it had before, but everything was different. Scarlett turned to Noah. "If I asked you now, what would you wish for?" He thought about it, about the year they'd survived, the battles they'd fought, the life they'd built from broken pieces. "I have everything I wished for," he said simply. "What about you?" Scarlett looked through the window at the house that was now her home, at the tree they'd decorated together, at Casey's stocking hung next to hers. "I wish," she said slowly, "for more days exactly like this. Ordinary days where nothing terrible happens. Where I drink coffee and teach kids to paint and come home to you and Casey. Where I'm not afraid, where I'm just happy." Noah pulled her close. "That's what we get now. Ordinary days. As many as we want." She buried her face in his shoulder. "Promise." He held her tighter. "Promise." Inside, the fire crackled. Casey's breathing was steady and peaceful. The tree lights glowed softly. It was ordinary. It was perfect. It was everything neither of them had thought they'd find again. Scarlett had run from a life that looked perfect, but felt like prison. Noah had been stuck in grief, unable to imagine feeling whole again. And somehow, impossibly, they'd found each other. Two broken people becoming stronger at the broken places. "Merry Christmas, Noah," Scarlett whispered. He smiled into her hair. "Merry Christmas, Scarlett." They stood there in the snow, holding each other, no longer alone. Just two people who'd wished for something simple and found it. Not in grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but in the quiet, steady act of showing up. Day after day, year after year, together. And that, Noah thought as he looked at his wife, was the best kind of miracle. The kind you built yourself, one ordinary day at a time. The kind that started with honesty on a snowy Christmas Eve. The kind that began with admitting you were alone and ended with realizing you never would be again.